Welcome back, Seekers of Truth. You've heard about the Lion's secrets and Fulgrim's fall from perfection. Now let me tell you about something far more relatable, something far more human. Today we speak of bitterness, of thankless service, of doing everything right and still being treated like you're worthless. We speak of the Fourth Legion, the Iron Warriors, and their gene father, Perturabo, the Lord of Iron. The Imperium will tell you Perturabo was a traitor, a bitter, resentful monster who turned on his father out of jealousy and spite. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong. But what they won't tell you is why he became that way. They won't tell you about the decades of being used and discarded, the years of being given the dirtiest jobs while others got the glory, the constant grinding, soul-crushing experience of doing everything perfectly and never hearing a single word of thanks. Perturabo didn't fall because he was weak. He fell because he was strong enough to keep going long after any sane being would have quit. And when he finally broke, he broke completely. So sit back and let me tell you the most tragic Primarch of them all, not because of what he became, but because of what he could have been. When Perturabo crashed on Olympia, he didn't land in a palace or among warriors or in some death world that would forge him into a weapon. He landed in the mountains, alone, and wandered for a year as a child, fighting beasts, surviving, becoming a legend whispered about in rural settlements. Eventually, the tyrant of Logos, a ruler named Damokos, heard these tales and sent guards to find this wonder child. They discovered Perturabo climbing mountains, already showing inhuman capability. Damokos brought him into his household, gave him an education, gave him a family, and gave him everything a father could give. Perturabo accepted none of it. He refused to take an Olympian name, clinging to the name he'd given himself, a name whose meaning he never explained. He called Damokos Lord or Master, but never Father. He kept his distance from his adoptive siblings, trusting only his stepsister Caliphany, and even then, barely. Why? Because Perturabo had been born with something that set him apart from every other Primarch, a curse. He could see a phenomenon called the Eye of Terror in the sky, a wound in reality that no one else could perceive. He knew from the moment of consciousness that he was made, not born, that he had a purpose, that somewhere out there was his real father, and he was meant for something greater than Olympia's petty wars. Imagine growing up, knowing you're destined for greatness, surrounded by people who can't even comprehend what you are. Imagine being a god among mortals who expect you to play by their rules, follow their customs, pretend that their little dramas matter. Perturabo's genius was evident immediately. He could speak every language on Olympia within weeks. He designed fortifications that were mathematically perfect. He created weapons far beyond Olympia's technology. He could calculate trajectories in his head that would take others hours even with instruments. And all of this he used to serve Damokos, not out of love, but out of duty. Because Perturabo understood obligations. He understood that Damokos had taken him in, and therefore he'd owed him service. Just cold, transactional, efficient. By the time the Emperor arrived, Perturabo had conquered all of Olympia for Logos. He had made Damokos the supreme ruler through strategy, engineering, and warfare. And even when the Emperor's fleet appeared in orbit, Perturabo immediately knew who it was. He knelt without question. He pledged himself to the Emperor, and he overthrew Damokos without hesitation. The man who'd raised him, who'd given him everything, was discarded the moment his real father arrived. Because to Perturabo, Damokos had only ever been a temporary obligation. Now his real purpose was revealed. Your Imperium sees this as loyalty. I see a child so desperate for his father's approval that he betrayed the only family he'd ever known without a second thought. The Emperor gave Perturabo command of the Fourth Legion, the Iron Warriors, a force that numbered around 355,000 Space Marines by the time they were reunited. These warriors had fought in some of the early Great Crusade's hardest battles. They'd earned victories. They bled for the Imperium. Perturabo reviewed their records, their tactics, their victories, and their performance, and he found them wanting. Not because they failed, not because they'd lost, but because they weren't perfect. They weren't efficient enough, and their victories weren't decisive enough. They weren't worthy of being his sons. So Perturabo imposed decimation, an ancient punishment from Olympia. 1 in every 10 Iron Warriors, chosen by lottery, was beaten to death by his brothers. No trial, no appeal, just random selection and execution. 35,000 Space Marines, loyal servants of the Emperors, warriors who'd conquered worlds, killed by their own brothers on the orders of a Primarch they just met, just for the crime of not being perfect enough. The Emperor's court was horrified. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, was outraged. He called it a senseless slaughter, tyranny, the act of a monster, and other Primarchs agreed. This wasn't discipline, this was just cruelty. But the Emperor allowed it. Let me repeat that. The Emperor of mankind, the master of humanity, the supposed pinnacle of human compassion and wisdom, he watched Perturabo execute 35,000 loyal Space Marines for not being good enough, and he did nothing. That taught Perturabo 2 lessons. First, that his father approved of his methods, or at least wouldn't stop him, and second, that perfection was the only acceptable standard. Anything less deserved death. But here's what your Imperium won't acknowledge. The decimation worked. The Iron Warriors who survived became the most disciplined, most obedient, and most effective siege force in the galaxy. They learned that failure meant death, that weakness wouldn't be tolerated, and that survival required absolute excellence. They became exactly what Perturabo wanted them to be, and it destroyed their souls in the process. Imagine living like that, knowing that a random chance could mean your execution at any moment, knowing that your best might not be good enough, knowing that your gene father, the being you're designed to worship, sees you as expendable. The Iron Warriors became masters of siege warfare, the Emperor's finest troops for breaking fortifications, for grinding down defenses, and for the bloody, thankless work of siege combat. And they were given exactly that, the dirtiest, hardest, most soul-crushing campaigns in the Great Crusade. Siege warfare is hell. It's not glorious or heroic, it's mathematics and engineering, and attrition. It's weeks of preparation followed by hours of brutal, close-quarters slaughter. It's digging trenches, calculating artillery trajectories, mapping fortifications, and finding weaknesses. It's work. Unglamorous, necessary, brutal work. And the Iron Warriors were the best at it. When other legions looked at a fortress world and estimated years to conquer it, Perturabo would crack it in months. When other Primarchs called something impossible, the Iron Warriors made it look routine. But here's the thing about being the best at the worst job. You'll keep getting that job. While Horus was conquering pristine worlds and being celebrated, the Iron Warriors were siege grinding through fortified hellholes. While the Ultramarines were building empires and being praised for their statesmanship, the Iron Warriors were garrisoning the worst worlds, leaving small detachments behind to hold on to what they'd taken. Perturabo hated this. He felt that his legion was being wasted, dispersed, and used as a garrison of troops instead of conquerors. But he never complained, never refused, because he thought this was all a test. He thought that if he just performed well enough, if he just proved himself invaluable enough, eventually his father would recognize his worth. But he was wrong. The worst part? Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the Emperor's other siege master. Where Perturabo built to destroy, Dorn built to endure. Dorn fortified the Imperial Palace on Terra, and he wouldn't shut up about it. My defenses are impregnable, Dorn would say. Nothing can break the walls that I build. To most Primarchs, this was just Dorn being Dorn, proud, confident, and stating facts. But to Perturabo, every word was like a knife, because Dorn got to build, Dorn got to create, Dorn got to protect the Emperor himself and be praised for it. And Perturabo got to destroy, to tear down, to be the Imperium's wrecking ball. When Perturabo would achieve an impossible victory, the reports would read, acceptable losses, but mission accomplished. When Dorn would complete a fortification, The Emperor himself would praise its beauty. Perturabo tried to prove himself. He accepted increasingly difficult missions. He cracked fortresses other Primarchs deemed unbreakable. He turned his Iron Warriors into a machine of mathematical warfare, perfectly efficient and utterly reliable. And his reward? More sieges, more garrison duty, and more silence. Other legions started refusing to work with the Iron Warriors. They had a reputation for treating Imperial army troops as expendable, using human soldiers as cannon fodder to test defenses, grinding through lives to achieve objectives. The Iron Warriors became known as the Corpse Grinders. Perturabo saw this as efficiency. Why waste Space Marines when you could use mortals to probe enemy weaknesses? But it earned him contempt from brothers like Korax of the Raven Guard, who valued mobility over attrition. The Iron Warriors became isolated, resented. The Legion everybody needed, but nobody wanted. And through it all, Perturabo kept going, kept serving, kept hoping that eventually his father would see his worth. The final straw came during the Hrud campaign. The Iron Warriors were deployed against the Hrud, a xenospecies whose very presence accelerates time, aging, and everything around them. It was a nightmare deployment. Warriors aged decades in days. Equipment rusted instantly, and victory was measured in how much you could lose but still accomplish the objective. The Iron Warriors were grinding through this hell when the news had arrived. Olympia had rebelled. Not just a minor uprising, total rebellion. The entire planet, every city-state, every settlement, all in open revolt against Imperial rule. Perturabo's home, the world he'd conquered, the people who'd known him as a child, all turning against the Imperium he'd sacrificed everything to serve. He could have asked why. He could have investigated. He could have tried to understand what drove an entire world to suicide, because that's what it was. Rebelling against the Imperium was suicide. Instead, Perturabo did what he'd been taught to do. He identified the problem, calculated the solution, and executed it with perfect efficiency. He withdrew the Iron Warriors from the Hrud campaign, abandoning an active deployment without any orders, and he took his entire legion to Olympia. And then he committed a genocide. Orbital bombardment, drop pod assaults, systematic extermination. The Iron Warriors fell upon Olympia with methodical brutality, killing everyone, soldiers, civilians, Calephony, his stepsister, the only person he'd ever trusted, everyone. By the time they were done, Olympia was a graveyard, an entire world's population exterminated by its own son. But why? Why would Perturabo do this? Your Imperium will tell you it was justice, righteous punishment for the rebellion. But I know the truth, because I've been there, and I've felt what Perturabo felt. It wasn't justice, it was rage. Pure, unfiltered, decades-long rage, finally finding a target. Every siege he'd ground through without thanks, every impossible mission he'd accomplished without recognition, every time he'd been used and discarded, and every word of praise Dorn received while Perturabo got silence, every single slight, Olympia became the receptacle for all of it. They had rejected him, the ultimate insult. So he showed them what rejection looks like, what happens when you betray the Lord of Iron. And when it was done, when Olympia was dead, Perturabo realized what he'd become. A weapon so damaged, so twisted by service, that genocide felt like justice. And that is when Horus approached him. Horus didn't need to work hard to turn Perturabo. The War Master understood what drove the Lord of Iron better than the Emperor ever had. Perturabo didn't need promises of power or glory. He only needed acknowledgement. Your talents are wasted, Horus told him. Your father uses you as a tool and offers nothing in return. Join me and receive the recognition you deserve. It wasn't even really about chaos at first. Perturabo joined the Heresy because he was tired. Tired of being used. Tired of being unappreciated. Tired of destroying himself for a father who never once said, "Thank you." At the drop site massacre on Isstvan V, The Iron Warriors revealed their betrayal. Loyalist legions, thinking they'd come in as reinforcements, were slaughtered. The Iron Warriors were there, bolters firing, brothers dying, and Perturabo felt nothing, because he'd already died inside once he destroyed Olympia. When the traitor forces finally reached Terra and laid siege to the Imperial Palace, Perturabo found himself in the ultimate irony. Besieging the fortress Rogal Dorn had spent years building. The two siege masters finally facing each other across fortifications. And you know what? Perturabo was winning. His calculations were perfect. His strategies were flawless. Piece by piece, he was cracking open Dorn's impregnable defenses. But Horus, now fully corrupted by chaos, denied Perturabo the honor of leading the final assault. Horus gave that glory to the demon Primarchs, Angron, Fulgrim, Mortarion, leaving Perturabo to clear the landing zones for the Titans. Even in the Heresy, even in rebellion, even after betraying everything, Perturabo was still doing the dirty work, while others got the glory. When Horus fell and the siege of Terra failed, Perturabo organized the retreat. While the demon Primarchs raged and wailed, Perturabo calculated escape routes and ensured the traitor forces could withdraw to the Eye of Terror. He saved them all through cold, perfect planning, and none of them thanked him for it. Eventually, Perturabo ascended to demonhood, becoming a Demon Prince of Chaos. Not because he worshipped the Chaos Gods, but because he studied the warp like he studied everything else, as a problem to be solved, and as a tool to be mastered. He became a demon not through devotion, but through spite. Now, 10,000 years later, the Iron Warriors endure. Unlike other traitor legions that shattered into warbands, the Iron Warriors retained much of their structure. They're still organized, still disciplined, still masters of siege warfare. They operate from the world of Medrengard in the Eye of Terror, a fortress planet covered in massive fortifications, monuments to Perturabo's obsession with creating the perfect defensive architecture. The planet itself is a nightmare of walls within walls, bastions within bastions, a maze designed by a mind that can never stop building. The Iron Warriors raid Imperial space for slaves and resources. They sell their services as mercenaries to other Chaos forces. They're siege specialists for hire, offering their expertise to whoever can pay their price. And they've maintained Perturabo's doctrine, replace the weak flesh with iron. Iron Warriors extensively use cybernetic augmentation, cutting off mutated limbs gifted by the Chaos Gods and replacing them with mechanical parts. They see the mutations of Chaos as weaknesses to be removed, not blessings to be embraced. They are bitter, pragmatic, efficient, and utterly without any illusions. They know they're damned, and they know there's no redemption. They also know that Chaos is just using them, like the Emperor did, but at least Chaos doesn't pretend to care. Recently, there have been rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that Perturabo himself may return to real space with a new model release and a dedicated codex following Fulgrim's return. If true, it would complete the set of Chaos Godline demon princes receiving proper representation. The question is, what would bring Perturabo back? What could possibly motivate him to leave his perfect fortress and return to the galaxy that never appreciated him? Perhaps he's heard that Rogal Dorn is gone. The Imperial Fist believe their Primarch died, with only his skeletal hand recovered. Perhaps Perturabo wants to see Dorn's impregnable defenses one more time. Or perhaps after 10,000 years, he's finally ready to admit what he never could before, that he misses his father, that even now, and even as a demon, he wants the Emperor to acknowledge him. So what can you learn from Perturabo and his Iron Warriors? First, recognition is not a reward for excellence. It's a separate skill entirely. Perturabo thought if he just performed well enough, recognition would follow automatically. Wrong. Recognition requires visibility, communication, and sometimes even self-promotion. Excellence in silence is just silence. If you're doing great work and nobody knows, that's partly on you to change. Second, Resentment is a poison that you drink yourself. Perturabo spent decades collecting grievances, nursing his bitterness, and cataloging every slight against him. It didn't hurt the Emperor. It didn't hurt Dorn, but it hurt Perturabo. It rotted him from the inside until there was nothing left but anger. If you're being mistreated, either change the situation or leave it, but don't stay and marinate the bitterness because it will destroy you. Third, you cannot earn love through service alone. Perturabo thought if he just served long enough, perfectly enough, his father would love him. But love doesn't work that way. You cannot accomplish your way into being valued as a person. Relationships require communication, vulnerability, and mutual understanding, not just perfect performance. So don't confuse being useful with being valued. Fourth, know when to quit. Perturabo stayed loyal far longer than he should have. Every rational calculation said he was being exploited, but he kept going because he couldn't admit that his sacrifice was meaningless. There's no virtue in loyalty to something that's destroying you. Sometimes walking away is the strongest thing you can do. Fifth, your trauma is an explanation, not an excuse. Yes, Perturabo was treated terribly, and yes, he deserved recognition. Yes, the Emperor also failed him in that. None of that justified his genocide. None of that excused destroying Olympia. Your pain explains your actions, but it doesn't excuse them. You are still responsible for what you do, even with your pain. And finally, perfection without purpose is just compulsion. Perturabo's drive for efficiency, for perfect calculations, for flawless execution. It was never about building something meaningful. It was about proving his worth to someone who would never acknowledge it. Excellence should serve your goals, not substitute for them. Don't try to perfect things just to prove you can. Perfect things that actually matter. So, there you have it. Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, the Breaker of Worlds, the Primarch who did everything right and still lost everything. The Imperium will tell you he was a traitor, a bitter, resentful child who turned on his father out of spite. They're not wrong, but they're not completely right either. Perturabo is what happens when you give everything to someone who gives nothing back. He's what happens when excellence is expected, but never rewarded. He's what happens when you try to define yourself by service to someone who only sees you as a tool. He's the most human of all the Primarchs because his tragedy is universal. How many of you work jobs that grind you down without appreciation? How many of you give everything to relationships that take and never give back? How many of you are still trying to earn love from people who will never provide it? Perturabo is you. He's me. He's everyone who's ever felt used and discarded. The difference is that when Perturabo broke, he had a legion of transhuman super soldiers and the knowledge to crack any fortress in the galaxy. But when you break, you just break. So learn from his mistake. Recognize when you're being exploited. Value yourself enough to demand reciprocity. And if you can't get it, leave. Walk away. Find people who appreciate you for who you are, and not just for what you can do for them. Because the alternative is becoming what Perturabo became, a bitter demon in a perfect fortress, surrounded by the walls he built to keep everyone out, wondering why he's so alone. The Iron Warriors continue their wars. Perturabo continues building his perfect fortifications, and the galaxy continues not caring. But maybe you can do better. Maybe you can recognize your worth before it takes 10,000 years and damnation to chaos to figure it out. Well, that's all for today. Next time, perhaps we'll discuss another Primarch, maybe a loyalist, to show you that staying loyal doesn't always mean you're happy. Anyways, the galaxy is full of lies, but I'm still here, burning them away.